Hello, everybody. Today we are talking about the 8th President of the United States, a man named Martin Van Buren. He's a very interesting character if you look at him historically, and depending on who you are, you may have different opinions of him. Today we're going to learn a little bit about him, and you'll decide for yourself whether or not he was a cool dude or kind of sketchy. Cool. So it was once said about Martin Van Buren, he is an artful, cunning, intriguing, selfish, speculating lawyer. My question to you is, would you want a person described that way to be the president? Let's break it down. Artful. Okay, if a president's artful, that doesn't sound too bad. Cunning. Well, I guess that's good or bad, depending on how you look at it. Intriguing. Okay. Selfish. Speculating. And a lawyer. Oh, Lord. All right, well, we've got our work cut out for us. He sounds like an interesting guy. Let's learn a little bit more about him. Martin Van Buren is a really interesting president because he's the first for a lot of different things. So for the first thing, he's actually the first president to ever actually be born as an American citizen. Everybody else we've looked at, the other 7 previous presidents, have been born while we were still under British rule. And a majority of them played some kind of, role in gaining independence. But Martin Van Buren is the first president moving forward that was actually born after America was created. So he was born as an American citizen instead of being an English citizen that gained their independence. So that's a big first. He's also the first president of the United States from New York, and he will not be the last. There are many presidents that come from New York, but he's the first one we're going to see here. He's also a lawyer, of course. A lot of some of the presidents we've looked at before have been a lawyer. Possibly the most interesting fact about Martin Van Buren is his father was Dutch. So he came from a long line of Dutch immigrants that had immigrated generations before he was born, I think 3 or 4. And so in his house, they spoke Dutch. That was their primary language. And then when they had to converse outside of their Dutch, community, they would use English. And because of this, he is the only president so far that has English as a second language. English is actually his second language. He learned Dutch first. So that's pretty cool. Let's see. He comes to power in the election of 1836. So if we rewind, remember, Andrew Jackson is the president. Andrew Jackson had selected Martin Van Buren to be a part of his cabinet, but after the Petticoat affair, Martin Van Buren resigned. So he was not a formal member of the cabinet. However, he served in Jackson's kitchen cabinet, his informal kind of group of inner circle, his bros, who would come over and give him advice. So Martin Van Buren's been in the background, and since we haven't really talked about him, but what's really, really fascinating about Martin Van Buren is if you go and look back, all the stuff we've covered so far, he's been there for. He was the driving force behind the creation of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party, remember, brand new, kind of, builds itself around Andrew Jackson and the whole idea of the common man and stuff, but it was actually Martin Van Buren pulling all those strings and setting that up. So he's really, really involved. He just hasn't been, a front runner yet. But Jackson decides he's not going to run again. He's going to follow the precedent that George Washington said he's going to retire. But he says, hey, if you guys like me, and the Democrats say, yes, we really like you, Andrew Jackson. He goes, cool. If you like me, go ahead and select this guy. He's just like me. He's my vice president, Van Buren. So the Democrats say, okay, cool. In the election of 1836, we will select Martin Van Buren, and he will be our nominee. On the other hand, Martin Van Buren has to run against the new political party that has just formed. So the Democrats formed with Andrew Jackson, and now there's a new political party. Basically, the Democratic Republicans kind of remix themselves and start to kind of glob on and start to kind of combine with the old Federalists, and now we have the Whig Party. So now the 2 major parties, right, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans are gone. Now it's the Democrats and the Whigs. The Whigs is the major party led by, of course, Henry Clay. However, Henry Clay's daughter has recently died during this election, so for that reason he decides not to run. He also doesn't think the Whigs are going to be able to beat Martin Van Buren, and he's right. So anyway, long story short, the Whigs decide, okay, we need to run against Martin Van Buren. We don't really know exactly where the Whig Party's at in terms of who's going to be able to beat him. So what they attempt to do is run a bunch of people, and that's exactly what ends up happening. The Whigs run 4 different nominees, so it's 4 Whigs versus Martin Van Buren. And the plan is, if they can have all of these people running against Martin Van Buren, what's going to happen is the same thing that happened in the election of 1824, when there were so many people running, including Henry Clay, John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson. When there are so many people running, it's really hard to get the majority. Remember, there's a difference between having the most and having the majority. You need the majority to win. So the plan is put as many people up as possible and make it hard for Martin Van Buren to get the majority. Make it hard for them to get more than everybody else combined. That's the plan. And it worked in the election of 1824, but it doesn't work in the election of 1836 because Jackson's so popular and because the Democrats have gathered so much power and steam, and because Jackson says, vote for him if you like me, the Democrats easily sweep the election. It is a landslide victory. Martin Van Buren easily wins, and he becomes the 8th president of the United States. His vice president is a man named Richard Johnson. The man you see in the lower right of your screen, that's a man named William Henry Harrison. He was the leading Whig that some people thought had a chance to beat Van Buren, but he doesn't. But he'll come into play later. He will be a future president. All right, here's a bunch of political cartoons. We're going to skip over these. In class, I'd have you analyze them. It's no mistake that Napoleon's sitting right here lording over Andrew Jackson, right? It's no mistake that Martin Van Buren is portrayed here as very, very tiny. He is very stout. He is 5'6". He's one of the shortest presidents we've ever had, and that comes into play a lot. Once again, here we have Martin Van Buren. You can always tell because of the hair, right? And then you have this eagle guy who's William Henry Harrison. Here we go again. Oh, this is getting a little freaky. All right, we've got this little Martin Van Buren. We can tell from the hair, right? And the title is The Little Magician. Now, what does that mean? Martin Van Buren was, kind of okay at some stuff. But one thing he was great at is having nicknames. He had a ton of different nicknames. And as I mentioned, he's very, very tiny, right? And he's doing a lot of stuff behind the scenes. He's running around. He's always involved. He's like a less evil Henry Clay. Right? He's involved in literally everything. He literally invented the Democratic Party, basically, and then made it look like it was Andrew Jackson so he could get popular. And then when it was his turn, he's like, yeah, by the way, it was me, right? He's a genius when it comes to pulling the strings, and he's a puppet master. And so he gets the nickname Little Magician because he's pulling the strings. He makes everything work. He's kind of sketchy, kind of shifty, but he's fun to watch. Another one is Martin Van Ruin. So this is so funny to me. As soon as he becomes president, the economy kind of tanks, and instead of calling him Martin Van Buren, they start calling him Martin Van Ruin, and it's just so funny. Like, it's just a simple play on words, but I feel so bad laughing at it, but it's so funny. Okay, another thing they start calling him is the Red Fox of Kinderhook. So foxes are kind of shifty, kind of sketchy, running around all the time, doing, sketchy stuff, and he comes from an area called Kinderhook. All right, so that one, that one was kind of cool, but what really catches on is Old Kinderhook. Remember that Andrew Jackson's nickname was Old Hickory because he was old and sketchy and scary, and he was also as tough as a hickory tree. So they start saying, oh, let's give him like a Andrew Jackson kind of nickname. So they just put old in front of something that means something to him, which is Kinderhook. Now, this is important because as people who support Van Buren start to come out of the woodwork, they start to say, yeah, we're members of the Old Kinderhook. Okay. And that's how the term okay kind of starts to come about. Now, this is a little bit different than OKAY, which eventually turns into its own word, but the phrase using okay to mean, yeah, we're good, let's do it, really starts in this election. So if you've ever used the phrase okay, Martin Van Ruin, you can thank for that. All right, so as I already prefaced, unfortunately for Martin Van Buren, not ruin yet, he does ruin it, the economy tanks pretty much the second he takes office. inflation rises, people can barely afford anything, they lose their money, some people lose their farms, the banks close. It's not good. It's a Great Depression. It's one of the worst financial crises we've had in our nation's history. Right now we're currently trying to one-up it, but at this point this is really, really bad. Here's a picture. We would take some time to analyze this, right? Here's Andrew Jackson's portrait kind of fading away. Here's Van Buren's kind of looking over all the starving children, right? Okay. How does Martin Van Buren respond to this horrible depression that's going on? He uses a strategy called laissez-faire. Laissez-faire is a French term. The easiest way to explain it is hands off. It literally means that the government is going to do nothing. So banks start to close, the economy's terrible, inflation is high, and the people look to Martin Van Buren and say, please, Martin Van Buren, what are you going to do to help us? And he says, well, I'm a Democrat, and I believe that the government should be small. And they're like, well, I guess, yeah, that's what Democrats believe. And he goes, not only should it be small, but they should literally do nothing. And the people are like, what do you mean? And Martin Van Buren stands firm on the policy of laissez-faire, that the government should not get involved in things and should not help the people. He believes that the economy will eventually fix itself. Now, in his defense, that is typically what happens to the economy. It ebbs and flows, there are highs and lows, absolutely. But what happens is when so many people are so desperate, you need to do something. And at the very least, you need to make it look like you're doing something or people lose faith in you. And that's exactly what ends up happening. Because of his strong stance on laissez-faire and because he refuses to compromise until, kind of towards the end of his first term, people are going to lose faith in Martin Van Buren. They're going to lose allegiance. And even some of the strongest Jackson supporters are going to say, listen, this guy's just not doing it for us anymore. He needs to step up. He's missed the boat. We have now turned against Martin Van Buren. So the Panic of 1837 and then the economic crisis afterwards is going to really turn the tides and cause Martin Van Buren to gain his nickname, Martin Van Ruin. Another thing going against Martin Van Buren is his wife dies, and so he has no first lady. And at this point in history, these first ladies are supposed to put on these major parties. And these parties are really important in Washington, D.C., and because he doesn't have a wife, when his son gets married, he uses his daughter-in-law named Angelica. And Angelica learns how to become a host. She's trained under Dolly Madison, James Madison's wife, who's still alive, if you can believe that. And she also goes to Europe and she visits and she sees how the English host parties and she sees how the French host parties, and she starts to really, really like the way that the English and French party. But England and France have money and America doesn't. So she comes home and puts on these lavish parties in the executive mansion in the White House, and she's inviting all these people to them, but a majority of people in DC and Virginia are staring at her going, what do you mean? We're starving to death and you guys are throwing parties? And they say, could you please, send some money for bread? And Martin Van Buren goes, no, but we've got, $100 going towards wine tonight. And it's just a really, really bad look. It shows that the president is very removed from the problems that people have, which further increases the idea that he's very removed and doesn't seem to care that Americans are suffering. This is really going to hurt him when it comes time for re-election. Also, I'll just say real quick, Angelica has some hedges trimmed in the garden, and apparently there were two of them close together and they look like boobs and everyone lost their mind. Anyway, the Olmsted case is also going to occur, but we looked at that earlier. That's the one that John Quincy Adams argues for, so we already looked at that. Here's some other things, blah, 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 and here's where we'll leave it. Martin Van Buren, a very famous quote from him, it is easier to do a job right than to explain why you didn't. I want you guys to think about that, and I want you to answer that as your exit ticket today. All right? Tell me how you feel about that. You either agree or don't. No right answer. I just want to know your thoughts. All right. Make sure to answer this question for me and have an amazing day. Bye-bye, guys.